Well, good morning, everybody. Or if you're in Europe, good afternoon. Or wherever else you are, good day to you. This is Eric Farnsworth with the Council of the Americas, coming to you from Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to be your host and moderator for the program today that we are entitling An Emerging Energy Alliance, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Today's program is one of many that we'll be doing here on energy at the Council and that we have been doing already. We live in an interconnected world. The need for reliable energy is something that everybody has in common. Europe's ongoing energy crisis, triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has far-reaching implications for Europe and also the rest of the world, as we're going to find out later this morning. Latin America and the Caribbean is a region that many have been calling an emerging energy powerhouse for some time. And it's perhaps right that Latin America and the Caribbean and Europe use this opportunity to figure out, is there a role for emerging partnership between these two very important regions of the world on energy? And can Latin America and the Caribbean really help secure Europe's cleaner energy future? Understanding the need for collaboration to examine the potential of these partnerships, Council today has the real pleasure to collaborate with the Bertelsmann Foundation. As you all know, Bertelsmann is an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit think tank here in DC. Actually, this is the DC arm of the think tank that's based in Europe, dedicated to a strong and lasting transatlantic relationship. As I mentioned, they're the US arm of the Germany-based Bertelsmann Stiftung. With their strong institutional support, today's event will also add to the story of the very important and in growing importance transatlantic relationship. The Council is very thankful for the support of the Bertelsmann staff, including Sam George. And Sam has joined us today to offer some welcome comments on behalf of Bertelsmann. Sam, we're going to turn it to you, and then we're going to start our program with the Energy Minister of Guyana. So ladies and gentlemen, Sam George with the Bertelsmann Stiftung here in Washington.
Yes, Eric, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. And thank you so much for this fantastic panel joining basically from all over the world, so many different fantastic perspectives. As Eric mentioned, my name is Samuel George. I'm the Global Markets and Digital Advisor for the Bertelsmann Foundation. I'm very happy to give this welcome on behalf of our Executive Director, Irene Brom, who would have loved to be here this morning but couldn't. And boy, this is just a really critical conversation. When the Council of the Americas and Eric and his staff came and raised this topic, we said, we need to talk about this. And it's a pleasure for the Bertelsmann Foundation to be a part of it with such a wonderful partner. We've actually worked with the Council of the Americas for a number of years. So it's great to be back in contact and kind of reinvigorate that collaboration. As Eric mentioned, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank based here in Washington, D.C., part of a far bigger sister institution, the Bertelsmann Stiftung in Germany. And I have to say, we have a fantastic representative of the Stiftung on this panel today, Miriam Kosmehl from the Stiftung, here live with us. So that's wonderful to have that collaboration as well. I think the Bertelsmann Foundation, we're really interested in transatlantic relations and the issues that are most important to the partners on both sides. We're talking about political, economic, social, digital, and especially where those interact and intersect. So it's fundamentally a transatlantic organization, but about a decade ago, we started to realize the importance of a broader understanding of transatlantic relationship. That, in order for this relationship to survive and to thrive, it has to be about more than just the initial core partners in North America and Europe. And we started looking at the broader transatlantic region and started looking at Latin America. And that was the key insight behind the work we've done in the region, like the Pacific Pumas, an emerging model for emerging markets, where we said, look, this is a region that has a tremendous amount to offer the core transatlantic partners, and it would be a mistake to not fully engage that region. And I think that's the basic insight that's brought us together today. We say, hey, there's a clear and present danger associated with the energy strategy that Europe currently follows. And it's by no means clear that those dangers will ease in the near term. And then meanwhile, we observe Latin America as one of the most energy prolific regions in the world. So I think it stands to reason to question, could this be an area of mutually beneficial cooperation? That's an excellent question. I don't know the answer, but we've assembled a fantastic panel of experts. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and it's my pleasure to pass it back to Eric and our partners at the Council of the Americas.
Well, Sam, thanks very much. And thanks again to you and your team for partnering with us. And hopefully this is the first of many discussions on this very important topic as you've laid out. Well, let's get to it. Let's get to that group of speakers we've been bragging about here already. Their bios are on our website. Website is www.as-coa.org. And the bios of our speakers are all listed there. For your information, should you choose to avail yourself of that information. Having said that, we will also be taking questions from our audience. So to the extent you would have a question that arises during the conversation, please feel free to put that in the chat, and we will take as many of those as we can. Please identify yourself by name and the organization that you're representing. If you do not, your question won't be asked. So there's some incentive to give us your identifying information, please. And with that, we are delighted to open our conversation today with our guest of honor, really, the Honorable Vickram Bharrat, who's Minister of Natural Resources of the Republic of Guyana. Guyana is not a country, Mr. Minister, that has had a lot of attention perhaps in the past, but you're getting a whole lot these days because of some really interesting things going on under your purview as the Energy Minister. And, you know, we'd love to hear not just what's happening in terms of the energy sector in Guyana, but also to the extent that you have some insights or thoughts at this early stage of Guyana's energy development in terms of how you think your country might be in a position to use some of this wonderful natural endowment to help address and alleviate some of what's going on in Europe and elsewhere around the world. So ladies and gentlemen, we have the pleasure to welcome to the Council and to the Bertelsmann Foundation, the Minister of Natural Resources of the Republic of Guyana, the Honorable Vickram Bharrat. Mr. Minister, over to you.
Thank you, Eric. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, let me say good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Let me start by saying that I'm happy to be a part of this discussion, this very important discussion this morning, because more and more we see the need for not only the type of discussion that we're having, but the cooperation and the action that is necessary to ensure there is some amount of energy security, taking into consideration the war in Ukraine, the post-COVID measures that we're dealing with, hardships that we're dealing with around the world, resulting in high cost of living, insecurities in terms of energy supply. So it is a very timely conversation that we're having this morning. If I may start with a brief background as to what is happening in Guyana in the energy sector and how we can play a part in solving some of these issues that may arise. First of all, let me say that Guyana is positioned, or we are located in South America, just off the Atlantic. However, because of our language, because of our common culture, common history, we are more associated with the Caribbean. We are part of the Caribbean community, which is called CARICOM. In fact, we are founding member of CARICOM. The four founding members being Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and Guyana. So even though we are in the mainland of South America, we are more associated with CARICOM, and we share a very close relationship with our sister CARICOM countries. Now, Guyana, as you mentioned, it is indeed the new kid on the block in terms of producing countries around the world and developments, investments coming to our country. We discover oil in 2015. First oil was December of 2019. Today we have 2 FPSOs operating, producing offshore Guyana with an average of 380,000 barrels per day. We have already signed 2 more production licenses. We expect a 3rd FPSO next year, mid next year, which will take our production to close to 600,000 per day. And then a fourth FPSO the following year, which will take our production to close to 900,000 per day. And of course, Exxon have already signaled their intention of submitting their fifth field development plan for approval. And that will see Guyana producing a million point one barrel per day in the next 4 to 5 years from now. For a new country, new oil producing country, we're moving, I must say that we're moving at unprecedented pace, the kind of pace that we haven't seen before. But I think we all realize the need for the urgency in exploration production of fossil at this point in time. I just returned from COP27, and the conversation is growing with regards to climate change, cutting emission. How do we mitigate? So it is very necessary that President Ali, His Excellency President Ali, will jokingly say that our depletion policy in Guyana is to get the oil as fast as possible out of the ground. Now, while we're doing this and while we recognize that there is high demand for fossils still throughout the world, we know too that at some point in time the demand will diminish. I personally don't believe the demand will disappear completely, but I do believe that there will be a significant reduction in demand as more and more countries move towards renewable energy. So that is something that we're factoring when we decide on our exploration production activities offshore Guyana. Having said that, it's not that we are a careless country. It's not that we are not focusing on our environment and how we can contribute in terms of being the lungs to the world. Guyana is actually a blessed country. I'm not sure if everyone have had the opportunity to visit Guyana, but our forest is the size of the United Kingdom. I know it may be unbelievable to some people, but it is true. Once you visit, you will see that. 90% of our standing forest is virgin forests. 86% of our country is covered in forests. Guyana is one of the few countries in the world, maybe with Suriname, Gabon, and a few more in the Congo Basin, that are carbon negative. So when many countries around the world are moving towards being, or making commitments to being carbon neutral and moving towards renewable, even though we are oil producing nation, we are carbon negative. And we are working towards maintaining that status and keeping our forests intact. I must also say that we boast maybe one of the best forest management system in the world, and the lowest deforestation rate also in the world, 0.045%. And we are committed to keeping it below 0.7%. So it is difficult for us to speak about energy security and fossil and hydrocarbon without placing some amount of emphasis on the environment and cutting emission. So as a small country, as a new oil producing country, we are playing our part in terms of keeping our environment clean and acting as the lungs for this part of the world, because I believe in our world today, it's only basically the Congo and the Amazon basin are the two major forests that are standing and that are contributing to mitigating climate changes around the world. Now, coming back to the hydrocarbon sector, that is in terms of oil production, we will be over 1 million, as I mentioned, in another 4 to 5 years from now. What we need to do too as a country, and we've started to do this recently, is to look at the utilization, monetization of our gas reserve. We haven't been focusing heavily on gas. We've been focusing more on crude, but we have shifted some amount of focus to gas because we realize the importance of it, and it has been seen more of a transitional fuel, moving away from the heavy products to lighter products, cutting emission again. In fact, we as a country, we are moving towards what we call the gas to energy project, whereby we are going to use gas to generate electricity. Right now, we're using HFO diesel, which, as you know, are high emitters. So we are looking at how do we monetize, utilize our gas reserves. We have been speaking with our sister countries, more especially Trinidad and Barbados, to see how together we can play a part in ensuring that there is energy security in Latin America and the Caribbean and the Americas as a whole, because we believe that Guyana has that potential, along with Trinidad and Barbados coming on board now, as well as Trinidad, the 4 CARICOM countries that have the potential and have the resources as well to make a big impact in the Americas in terms of ensuring that we're energy secure. So that basically is what is happening in Guyana right now. But if I'm spared maybe 2 or 3 minutes more quickly, I just want to highlight one point that we would like to make as a government. It's that we don't want Guyana to be seen as an oil producing nation alone. That is why I would have mentioned our forests and the capacity of our forests. We are going to trade our carbon credits very soon on the market, but we want to be seen as a country that is diverse, that we don't depend on oil and gas only. We have a big agriculture sector, as well as mining, forestry sector, tourism, ecotourism sector. We are trying basically not to make the mistakes that some countries would have made, oil producing countries would have made, and that is to neglect their traditional productive sectors for oil and gas, because we know the future of oil and gas as we move forward, especially with so many countries moving towards renewable resources. But the big question to that is there are so many commitments of countries moving to renewable resources, cutting emission, moving away from fossil. But can we really afford that? I think that is the big question. Sometimes we need to ask these questions and to seek commitments from others too. Because when you go to the COP, when you go to all these climate change conferences around the world, there are so much commitments that are being made. But at the end of the day, the resources that is needed to fulfill these commitments are not forthcoming. So that is a big question. That's why we see Guyana playing a role, our energy sector playing a major role in terms of assisting countries to fulfill those commitments, and for us as a country too, to fulfill our commitments to the international community as well as our locals in Guyana. Because the revenue is the key. Financing is key. There can be so much commitments, but if the financing is not available, then what will happen? Because there are calls around the world for Guyana and other countries to stop exploration. I don't believe that is the right thing to do at this point in time. We have seen the backlash of it. We have seen the backlash in some countries moving back towards using coals for energy production because of the restriction in financing towards new exploration in oil and gas. Now, we believe that as CARICOM, and I want to speak as CARICOM, Trinidad, Suriname, Guyana, Barbados, that we can be a major supplier to the Americas, that we are committed to working with your organization and governments in the Americas to ensure that there is some amount of energy security within our hemisphere, and also to lend some amount of support, as you mentioned, to Europe, because we know the situation that is facing the European countries, especially with the war in Ukraine, and not knowing when that war will come to an end. And not only the war coming to an end, but the rebuilding of infrastructure that will probably damage during the last couple of months of the war in Ukraine. So it will take a lot to rebuild. So there is definitely the need for us as the Caribbean, Latin America, to support our friends in Europe, and to ensure that there is some form of energy security and not to go backwards towards coals or chip wood chips being used as sources of energy. So I want to stop there because I know I maybe exceeded my time. So I just wanted to give a brief background as to what is happening in Guyana, and also to reinforce our commitment to working with the organization and governments to ensure that we play a part in this process too. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much for those terrific comments. Very balanced. You were right in your time frame, so thank you for that. And I hope you'll come back to the council at some point and really give us a fuller discussion. These issues really demand even more time to really get into, but what a great overview. I do want to highlight the point that you made, or that the minister made, about using transitional fuel from Guyana to help clean up the Caribbean energy space. Many Caribbean countries, as the minister indicated, are still burning diesel fuel to generate electricity. Not only is it highly inefficient in terms of economically, but environmentally it's disastrous. So I mean, this is a real time change, positive change that can be made as Guyana comes online. And as I understand it, Minister, you're going to be a major, I mean, you're already an energy exporter, but you're going to be a major energy exporter even by the end of this decade in terms of global energy markets, making a meaningful difference. So congratulations on all that's going on. And thank you for the broader understanding of your broader energy, environmental and also development policies. Very, very important to focus on those as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Minister, thank you for joining us this morning, or again, if you're in Europe, this afternoon. So the purpose of this conversation is really to highlight some of the good things that are going on energy-wise in the Western Hemisphere, specifically Latin America and the Caribbean, and to see this region potentially as a real partner for energy security in Europe. But to understand why we are even having this conversation, we kind of have to understand the energy scenario for Europe. And so we have assembled, or I should be more accurate, Bertelsmann Foundation, our partner, has assembled some terrific speakers who can speak to these issues and do so knowledgeably in the time that we have today. So what I'd like to do is start with Miriam Kosmehl. Miriam is a senior expert at German-based, at the Bertelsmann Stiftung, as Sam George already mentioned. Her bio again is on the chat and in the chat, and it's on our website if you'd like to go to that. Miriam, we just really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this program today. Can you give us an overview of how we got to this point in Europe, and what has the Russian attack on Ukraine really meant for energy security in Europe?
Thank you for inviting me. Maybe allow me to start with the 3 brief points to recall the situation overall before the war. The EU, this is my first point, produced itself hardly 1/5 of its own energy supplies. And at the same time, Russia was the major importer of or supplier of not only natural gas, but also oil and coal. Now, what is important to know is that within the EU, the dependencies on Russia greatly varied from country to country. And the EU as a bloc was actually not so badly positioned in terms of natural gas as a result of reforms and liberalization. Now, not all member states have been and are connected to what has become a common competition-oriented natural gas market, but particularly to highlight one reform by establishing interconnectors, physical links between member states that allowed for natural gas to go both ways, a lot has been achieved. Now, let's get to the war, or to a development that has started already before the war with Russia holding back natural gas, which led, as we all know, to a natural gas supply shock and to increased prices. Now, we have, as a result, much more than an energy security crisis, because this developments disturbed a strategy that the EU had, that particularly Germany had, to have natural gas as a bridging technology to renewables, as a clean fossil bridging technology. And this strategy, with that supply shock of natural gas, collapsed. So it made, moreover, in general, a dichotomy emerge between, on the one hand, securing energy supplies, and on the other hand, sticking to the 1.5 degree target to still fight climate change. Now, the EU pretty quickly came up with an emergency plan in June that had two major points: to save energy by 15%, and it underlined solidarity, which is because the natural gas market has been accomplished over the past years thanks to reforms and liberalization, as I described, which is possible. However, the question will only show, or the question remains, and the developments will show only now, whether this solidarity will work in practice. And this plan is not mandatory, though there is a particular clause that gives us a chance to look at it at the end of this year, depending on how the shortages or how the situation develops. Maybe I stop here.
I'm sorry, I had to find my unmute button. You know, after 3 years of pandemic, we're still looking for the mute buttons and the unmute buttons. Well, thank you very much. Great to have that very quick understanding of kind of how we got here. We're going to follow up with questions, but let's go to our next panelist to continue the conversation, Shaheen Balleh. Shaheen is the head of the Geoeconomics program at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Shaheen, we appreciate you joining the program as well. Can you give us a sense of the economic impact in Ukraine, of the war in Ukraine in the European Union? Give us a sense of, I mean, we're talking about energy specifically, but obviously energy has a much wider impact in the economies of the region, and that's real. Can you give us a sense of what that means going forward?
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to take part in this panel, and it's a pleasure to have heard Minister Bharrat. As you probably don't know, but I'm French, but my background is from the Caribbean. My mother is from Martinique, so I'm particularly attached to developments in the region. So I was very pleased to hear what Minister Bharrat said and to be part of this discussion. The shock in Europe economically is very profound, and what I find extremely concerning is that the policy response so far has been mostly targeted to the short term, to basically ensure that this winter is a winter that can go through without major economic disruptions. And I think that has been successful. So I think the economic policy response to date will ensure that we have a winter without rationing of gas and energy in Europe, and that's already a meaningful achievement. The big concern is that this may not be the case in the winter 2024 if we continue with the current energy system. And this is why securing new supplies for natural gas, but also diversifying energy mix away from fossil fuel will be a critical importance over the coming decade. And I think the big issue, and this was mentioned in passing by Miriam, is that the Europeans together have not come up yet with a coherent and cohesive view about how to address the medium-term energy challenges, let alone the economic consequences of these challenges. So I think there is a real urgency in Europe to think deeply about how we move away from our current energy system. And I don't think there is a realization yet that this will require very substantial investments, but also to a degree, Europeanization of energy policy, which historically has been very national. So I think we're in the process of a very deep transition towards the Europeanization of energy policy, towards the Europeanization of energy infrastructures. and towards the creation of the EU as a potential global actor in energy markets. So it might be that in the future, a country like Guyana will not engage directly with individual member states of the European Union, but could actually be directly engaging with the European Union as a buyer of natural gas. And I think that would be quite a profound change. So I think quite a few things happening on the European continent, and quite a few things that are yet to be resolved, which I think cast quite a long shadow on the European economic outlook. And if nothing is tragic in the short term, I think we have a lot of work to do to ensure that the coming years are not economically too destructive. And I think that's a real challenge that will require the full mobilization not only of European policymakers, but potentially a great engagement of the international community more broadly.
Yeah, and your point about short-term, attention at potential medium-term or longer-term cost, I think is a really important point, because at the end of the day, these issues are fundamentally political, aren't they? Politicians of any party are going to want to try to get through the current crisis, and we'll deal with the effects later. And so I think it's a really important point. I'm going to come back to that, and we want to discuss that a little bit further. But let's bring in our third panelist, Cornelius Fleischaker from the World Bank. He's a senior economist. Cornelius, we've heard very quickly, very briefly about some of the circumstances that Europe finds itself in. We heard a very optimistic presentation by the energy minister from Guyana. We also know that there are massive energy reserves throughout South America, throughout other parts of Latin America, and conversations are already ongoing, for example, between Uruguay or Argentina and countries of the EU in terms of supplying some of the needs. Do you see this over time as an emerging supply and demand relationship that could have really beneficial results for all parties? Or do you see this as kind of, to go to the earlier comments about short-term versus long-term, is this kind of a short-term palliative, but over time, the longer-term patterns will reassert themselves? How do you see Latin America and the Caribbean as really factoring into some of these longer-term strategic energy issues in Europe?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me on this panel. I'll be speaking on a personal capacity rather than representing the World Bank in any way. And yes, so I've worked on Latin America for many years. I'm now working on energy producing countries in Africa, but I'm from Germany originally. So of course, the European side of this story is also very close to me. I think the trade-off between the short term and the medium long term is actually very critical here. So what is very clear is that in the short term, we have very strong demand in Europe for gas from new sources, given that Europe, and especially I think my country, Germany, has made a big mistake in terms of relying too much on the cheap pipeline gas from Russia, rather than investing in the infrastructure that is needed to receive gas, or to be able to receive gas from other sources, which especially means LNG terminals, which Germany so far doesn't have. So we just have to be thankful for our European partners that are able to receive the seaborne gas, and the interconnectors that Miriam mentioned that allow the gas to now flow from the west to Germany rather than from the east, where it used to be coming from. Now, I think for gas producing countries and energy producing countries, this is a very difficult situation, right? Because of the trade-off between the short term and the long term. It's clear that countries that are able to export gas, particularly seaborne LNG in the short term, are benefiting greatly right now from this situation. Earlier this year, the German energy minister went to Qatar to essentially beg for more gas to make up for the shortfall. Now, I think the challenge is that many of those newer energy producers, newer gas producers, don't yet have the physical infrastructure to take advantage of this demand. And here, it's important to remember that gas is a little bit different from most other commodities, in that the market is not as integrated and liquid as for other commodities, simply because of the physical characteristics, right? So to receive natural gas, you either have to have a pipeline, or you need to go through the process of liquefying it, which is very technology challenging and expensive, and then put it on a ship, and then at the other end, gasify it again. So I think here the problem is that there's not that many countries that were ready to ship additional liquefied gas to Europe. So the countries that were like Qatar, maybe Algeria to some extent, were able to benefit from the situation in the short term. Other countries would have to invest in those infrastructures to be able to take advantage of this demand, while not knowing how strong the demand will be in the medium long term, right? So we don't know if or how piped gas from Russia will return to Europe. We don't know how quickly demand for natural gas in Europe will decline. I'm of the opinion that it will continue to decline. And I think some of the gas consumption reduction that we're seeing right now, some of it will likely be permanent, as more heating systems are shifted to electricity and away from natural gas. So the medium long-term outlook for gas demand from Europe may not be as strong as it appears right now, and as it will be this year, next year, and then maybe the year after. So I think countries are really in a difficult spot in terms of making decisions in long-term investment to deliver gas to Europe, not knowing if the demand will be there. On the other hand, I think what this crisis has shown is that infrastructures need to be resilient, that it's important to invest in something like a terminal to receive liquefied gas, even if at present you're not going to use it, because there may be a moment when you need it. I think another interesting discussion is how the investment in natural gas related technologies can relate to and be used for other cleaner purposes. I think the minister from Guyana has made an important point that they can use their natural gas to clean up their own energy production. There's a lot of discussion about hydrogen, where of course the long-term view is that hydrogen should be produced with renewable energy, but there may be some role for natural gas in a transition period. But I think that countries will be in a very difficult spot where they have to make long-term investment decisions based on what is right now a short-term demand and a very high uncertainty about the future of this demand. Thank you.
Yeah, your points about investment and trying to figure out the future for those investment patterns is really an important point. I'm reminded in the United States, before our own fracking revolution, we had people investing in LNG import facilities. That once the fracking revolution occurred and we had more natural gas than we could use ourselves, those same facilities had to be retrofitted to be export facilities at some significant cost. And for developing nations that don't have a lot of money necessarily to invest in infrastructure, you got to get it right, because you don't have a lot of chances to retrofit facilities. That's a really important point. If Minister Bharrat is still with us, I see that he's on. I don't know if he's still able to join, but I want to do a follow-up question with him. I know he has to go before the hour is up, but the question I want to ask him, Minister, if you're still there, is, speaking of fracking, there is a movement in some parts of the United States, but also we're aware in parts of Latin America that fracking is perceived as an environmental negative, and there are environmental movements against it. And I guess the question I would ask the minister is, do you see environmental movement, or let's say popular movement, against some of this energy development that might put a different gloss on some of your projections? In other words, things that might be politically uncomfortable to do. You mentioned Guyana specifically, and so maybe I'd like to expand the lens. I mean, we know what's happening in the same neighborhood with Colombia, with the new president of Colombia has said that they don't want to explore and drill anymore. There are other countries going down some of that similar road. You alluded to that. I wonder, do you see this as something that would potentially impinge on Latin American and Caribbean ability to function in this role with Europe that we've been talking about?
Thank you for the question, Eric. Let me start by just giving you an experience I recently went through on my trip to Uruguay. A guy came to me. I don't know who he was. He don't know who I am. And he asked me to sign a petition. So when I got into the details of what the petition was to stop countries from producing oil and gas. That was the petition. So I said, instead of asking or doing a petition to stop the supply or production of fossil fuel, why don't you do a petition to stop or reduce the demand for fossil fuel? Because if you stop the production of fossil fuel and demand is still high, then it will impact heavily on the population and on the people, because obviously prices will go up and people will suffer. There will be energy insecurities around the world. And then you realize that, maybe that is the best angle to take it from. I'm saying that because, yes, there are pressure on new countries like Guyana, especially small developing countries like Guyana, like Suriname, like Barbados, like Trinidad, and even in Africa, Ghana, and a few other countries are being pressured into not going into new exploration activities. The finances are not readily available for us to develop as fast as we want to. But then the question is, who will supply the demand that is available? Because there is still a high demand for fossil fuel. It means that if you're telling us as small developing countries with large deposits, as we've learned that Guyana now has, then you're creating a monopoly for the few big producers that have been always producing. And you're shutting out the small developing countries that need the resources even more to ensure that they fulfill their commitments of 100% renewable energy by 2050, or to cut emission, because that is why I made the point earlier. There's so many commitments of going renewable, of cutting emission, but who will finance it? Where will you get the resources to reach to that stage? Because it costs a lot. Renewable energy costs a lot. It is very expensive. We have to understand that. So it is a position that we have been fighting for a while. And you're right, there are pressure. There are pressure that is being put upon countries like us in Latin America and the other small developing oil producing country that we should not expand our oil and gas base. But at the end of the day, the demand is still there. The demand is still there. So I would like to say that the demand they need to focus, the powers that are fighting or putting pressure on countries to stop producing need maybe to shift their focus to cutting the demand for fossil. And automatically supply will reduce, because who will we sell to? So we are saying that the countries that have been producing for centuries, for decades, and they have developed their countries and their citizens are enjoying a good life with high quality services and facilities and amenities. We are saying that the small developing countries like Guyana and Trinidad and other countries in the Caribbean and Latin America deserve the same opportunity too, because the demand is there. That is the point. And from my perspective, the demand will remain there up until 2040, 2050. Then we maybe see a reduction in the demand, but I don't see the total phasing out of fossil fuel. So we will continue to fight this battle, Eric, because it is a battle that we're fighting. Thank you.
Thank you. No, and I wanted to give you the chance to respond to that because, I think your viewpoint is very, very important for our audience to hear. So I appreciate you taking the time to reflect on that question. Thank you, Mr. Minister, and thank you for your presence today. You've really added a lot to our conversation.
Thank you, Eric. And if I can be excused, please, because I have a few other engagements.
That's why I'm doing this. So we hope to see you again very soon.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Well, let's continue. Miriam, we've been talking a little bit about Europe's dependence on Russian supply. Let's posit that the war in Ukraine is not going to end anytime soon, although we all hope, I'm sure, that it ends very soon. What a tragedy and human catastrophe. But look, let's suggest perhaps that the energy relationship with Russia does not return to quote unquote normal anytime soon. Let me ask a two-part question. First, could Europe ever really break away from Russian gas completely if it had to? Number two, what would be some of those alternatives that Europe, that you would recommend that Europe really pursue, even in an environment of continued uncertainty with relation to the supply of Russian fuel?
Look, I believe that Europe did have a pretty good plan. That's why I mentioned natural gas as a bridging technology while renewables were put into place. And of course, Minister Bharrat is perfectly right. As long as there is a demand for fossil fuels, we see that with Russia right now, that it benefits by the high prices that exist. So I do believe that a warning signal to the European Union should be what has happened during the COVID crisis, where national member states did not cooperate and coordinate as good as they could. Moreover, climate policy requires not only cooperation within Europe, but cooperation globally, as the minister has also pointed out. Now, aside from all these known challenges about putting carbon emission prices in sync, this is now a tremendous challenge. I believe that climate policy is not caught up in the maelstrom of geopolitics. We have the largest emitters, well, Russia as, I believe, the fourth largest emitter waging this war of aggression. We have China as the largest emitter and the US as the second largest, having frozen their technology cooperation. Now, this is all very damaging for the innovation that we actually need to go forward in terms of effective climate policy. I do have some hope if I look at industries. I think some were pretty quick in adapting and coming up with new strategies. So I think, and again, I refer to the COVID crisis, if we combine to support innovation there and flank it by state money, that there may be a chance to come up with more ample solutions. I'll stop it here maybe for the other speakers to contribute.
Well, thank you very much. And I just got a note that Shaheen has a train that he has to board, but I wonder, Shaheen, if you have any final comments before you depart our panel for your train, or have you already left? I think we may have already lost him. He was in transit today, and he benefited our panel by joining us between trains, but you know, duty calls, and so here we are. Cornelius, let's come back to you then for your thoughts. You know, it's fascinating, the picture that's being painted, you know, transition, not just globally, but transition in terms of some of the regions themselves, you know, longstanding plans that people had been aggressively and intentionally pursuing have been thrown a kilter, first by COVID and now by wars of aggression, and, you know, where does it all end? But I guess the question from your perspective, or to you for your perspective, would be, you know, and I know you're not speaking on behalf of the World Bank, but how do you advise governments in terms of the path forward on energy security, right? Because everybody faces the same scenarios in terms of global climate change, with commitments coming out of the COP, you know, 1.5 degree, you know, ceilings, it faces everybody. At the same time, you've got some very different levels of development, as the minister was saying. The Chinese and the Indians argue at COP that they shouldn't be responsible for some of the same things that the developed countries should be. So it's a big mess in some ways. But at the same time, politicians have to deliver results for their people, and energy is part of that. Is there a common thread that you could point to or help us tease out what governments are facing and how they might deal with some of these issues? It's probably not a fair question, but I just would be curious as to your thoughts.
Well, it's a difficult question, but I'll give it a try. So I think what the minister earlier said is very true, that the decarbonization agenda as a global agenda, which is so important to our fight against climate change, is essentially about reducing demand for fossil fuels, and the attention on the supply side is in large part a little bit of a distraction, I think. Now, what this means for countries that have hydrocarbon resources and that are producing oil and gas is that, of course, in the near term they will continue to produce, they will continue to export, but they will have to be even more careful than in the past in terms of how they use the financial windfalls from this for their own transition and getting ready for a future where the demand for those hydrocarbons may not be there anymore, right? And there is a big discussion about who will be the last producer standing if demand actually declines significantly. And the economic point of view is that, well, it will be the lowest cost producers, right? And then countries will have to take a look at themselves and think about whether or not they are part of that. And that of course leads to what the minister earlier described, which is sort of this race that, well, we need to get this stuff out of the ground now, because now there is a high price right now. There is demand, and we don't know if there will be demand in the future. So I think that's the challenge that they're facing in the short term. Now, I think in the long term, we don't know exactly how much gas will be phased out, whether or not there will be still a sort of a permanent demand for natural gas. It may be the case, if we remember that natural gas has uses beyond just burning it for heat or electricity. Natural gas is used in industrial processes and making fertilizers and other things where maybe it will be harder to replace. Now, there's one point that I would slightly disagree with the minister, which is the point on renewable energy being expensive. Clearly, that's not necessarily the case, right? We know, for example, that countries that have a lot of hydropower, as is the case with some countries in Northern Europe, some countries in South America, increasingly some countries in Africa, like Angola, that is actually very cheap energy. And it has the additional advantage that hydropower can be integrated with solar power, which is also becoming increasingly cheap. As a form of storage to overcome some of the technical challenges with solar power. And I do believe that in the future, countries that have an abundance in clean energy, right, which means primarily clean electricity, be it from hydro, solar, wind, or a combination of these things, will be at a great advantage, because of course, decarbonization will not mean primarily reduced energy use or consumption. And so if things like the hydrogen revolution actually take off, countries that have an abundance of clean electricity will actually be very well placed to respond to that demand. So for some countries that currently export hydrocarbons, there may be an opportunity to actually transition to being still energy exporters, but not fossil energy exporters, but rather clean electricity, hydrogen, and maybe energy-intensive products exporters. And that could be a very, very interesting perspective for some of those countries, especially those countries that are blessed in more than one way, right? There's many countries that have hydrocarbons, but also have tremendous solar potential or hydro potential. So I think that's something that countries need to think very hard about, how they can use the remaining time of hydrocarbon wealth to really get ready for the next phase, and not stop necessarily being energy producers and exporters, but become clean energy producers and exporters. Thank you.
Thank you for those great comments. And despite me asking an unfair question, you handled it very, very well. So thank you for that. Two questions have come in for us. And in the short time that we have remaining, I want to throw them both out there to both of you, to the extent you'd care to address one or both of them. The first question has to do with investment. Do you see, from the perspective of Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean becoming more of a clean energy investment opportunity, and not just in the context, I mean, Cornelius was just talking about solar and hydro, which are massive already in Latin America, but also in terms of some of the mining and minerals that are required for cleaner energy future, lithium in particular, copper, that sort of thing. So is this part of the energy discussion that we need to be having with Europe as well? That's a leading question, but it's question number one. And then question number two has to do with trade. I know that we've asked both of you here to talk about energy, but this is the Council of the Americas, so there's inevitably going to be a trade question, I suppose. And the question is, Mercosur, the countries of Mercosur, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay have been negotiating for, I don't know, about 25 years with Europe in terms of a free trade agreement. That's been put on hold largely because of some of the Brazilian environmental policies under the outgoing president. At least that's what we've been told to, or that's what we understand. And the question being is, where does the need for cleaner energy and trade policy, where does that link up when we consider the needs of energy security? So again, I probably haven't articulated that question very clearly, but the one is on investment opportunities in the cleaner energy future in Latin America and the Caribbean. The second is the linkage between the environment, clean energy, and trade. And to the extent either of you have comments on either of those questions and would like to go first, I open it to either of you.
Thank you, Eric. Maybe I
Sure.
answer very briefly, because I'm not the person familiar with Latin America as Cornelius is. So of course, when we speak about investments, what comes to my mind first is the European neighborhood. I mean, Ukraine itself, had we not the war, would be the country for green hydrogen, to use even the old transport system. Also for wind energy, there is Morocco in the southern neighborhood for solar. So these are all partnerships, energy partnerships to be explored. And the second question, yes, trade, of course, and energy security, and also the issue of green energy are inextricably linked. I leave it there for Cornelius to have a chance to respond.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned hydrogen in terms of opportunities as well. So Cornelius, to you, please.
Yeah. So on the new energy opportunities, yes, I do think that Latin America has a role to play here, and great opportunities. And from what I understand, those are already beginning to be explored and tapped, right? I mean, I think Chile is leading on some of those agendas when it comes to building up renewable energy and the transformation of that into green hydrogen. Obviously, on the mining side, there's also a lot happening in places like Chile and Bolivia and elsewhere. So yes, I do think they have a big role to play, but of course they're not the only player in town, right? And so, on mining, that's always been the case. And I think on hydrogen in a way may become a little bit like LNG nowadays, right? That those countries that have the capacity to produce it and to put it on ships, which again is not the easiest thing to do. It requires technology and investment in infrastructure. But the countries who will be set up to do it will benefit, and they will then be in a marketplace to supply areas like Europe, and in a sense then also compete to the closer countries in the neighborhood, like Miriam mentioned, which in some cases may be able to supply through pipelines. So I think this will be a competitive environment, but there are some countries that are well placed in Latin America, as there are outside of Latin America, right? So Namibia, for example, is another country that's going very strong into the green hydrogen. They have some of the best solar potential in the world. There's a lot of cooperation already with Europe and Germany specifically in that case. So I think that's going to be a big market in the future. And yes, I think the countries that start early down this road and have the endowments will be at an advantage. On Mercosur, I'm not going to get into the discussion of the agreement and whether or not it will eventually or in the near term get done. Of course, there's a lot of politics involved in that. There's one related agenda, though, that is important, which is the question of carbon taxation of imports, right? Which is something which I think in Europe is actually relatively advanced, in the sense that there seems to be a lot of appetite in the EU to eventually have a carbon levy on imports. And again, that's going to put at an advantage those countries that have the abundant clean energy, right? So their hydrogen, their fertilizer, their steel, their whatever product it is that incorporates a significant amount of energy will be at a direct advantage in terms of trade tariffs if it's produced in a low carbon way. So I think that's another great opportunity for these countries to get into.
It is, and I'm reminded that South America has the cleanest energy matrix in the entire world, and that is precisely because of the extensive use of hydro to generate electricity that you've already referenced. What a terrific conversation. I wish we had more time to extend it. There are so many more questions I'd love to get to with both of you. But before we do, I wanted to see, Sam, did you have any concluding thoughts or comments? No? Okay, you're good. So based on that, let me also take one final note. Let me thank Marvin Wiley and Jorge Marino and Guillermo Subiaga from the Council of the Americas and everybody else who worked so hard to put this program together. I think the conversation was terrific. I want to thank the panelists for your insights. I wish you had a better moderator to drive the conversation, but your insights were really, really good. And we hope that you'll come back to the Council and to Bertelsmann again for a continuation of these conversations, which I don't think are going to go away anytime soon. We all need these issues and we need to get smart on them very, very soon. Thanks again. Thanks to all of our audience for joining us for this important program. The program in its entirety will be up on our website very, very soon. So if you want to go back and refresh some of the comments, feel free to do that. With that, we will close today's activities. Thank you again. We hope to see you again very, very soon. Goodbye.